Madam Speaker, it's my privilege and I'm proud to represent all the hardworking men, women and families of Lakeland, including Indigenous people across Lakeland and the Saddle Lake Cree Nation, Whitefish Lake Cree Nation, Kahiwin Cree Nation, Frog Lake Cree Nation, Onion Lake Cree Nation, as well as the Kikino, Buffalo Lake, Fishing Lake and Elizabeth Métis settlements. I'll speak about this motion put forward by the NDP today from the perspective of Indigenous involvement with energy development in Canada. I can only conclude the motion involves the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain expansion as a way to advance the narrative that Indigenous people and communities are opposed to responsible natural resource development and oil and gas in particular. Of course, Indigenous views of oil and gas and pipelines are not actually homogeneous, and there are a variety of different experiences and opinions within and between Indigenous communities, like all Canadians. So I'll take the opportunity to shed some light on the other half of that narrative that often is not discussed in this House or in the media. I was very proud when the previous Conservative government became the first one in Canada to officially apologize for the residential school system and launched the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to recognize factors behind socioeconomic challenges that Indigenous people disproportionately experience and to start working towards greater awareness, understanding and deeper knowledge between Canadians. Part of the path to reconciliation includes economic reconciliation. JP Gladue, President of the Canadian Council on Aboriginal Business, says, quote, First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities must have the resources to drive their own business endeavours and choose their own path forward, their own path toward economic growth without prejudice. He also said, quote, Aboriginal communities are going through a demographic boom, often in areas that face labour shortages and lack suppliers for local development projects. Canada cannot afford to lose the next generation of Aboriginal business talent. The cost of inaction will be heavy, and not just for Aboriginal peoples. The reason I wanted to speak to this motion was not just because I want to reaffirm my support for truth and reconciliation, but also to let the Indigenous communities in Lakeland and across Canada know that I and Conservatives support them in their pursuit of economic development and prosperity. But representing a riding that includes 8 First Nations and Métis communities in northern rural Alberta, and as a person who happens to be part Ojibwe myself, which is complicated in my family as it is in many, it dismays me that the left often uses First Nations as pawns in their anti-energy rhetoric, implying all First Nations and Métis people are against oil and gas. In Lakeland and certainly across Alberta, it is very common for First Nations and Métis people to be business owners and workers in energy and pipelines. Even AFN Chief Perry Bellegarde confirms 500 of the 630 First Nations in Canada are open to pipelines and support petroleum development. I'm inspired that First Nations, especially across Western Canada, are agitating increasingly publicly for themselves that they want more pipelines because that infrastructure is as crucial to the lifeblood of their communities and to opportunities for their young people as anywhere else. So let's talk about economic prosperity and what it really means. Around 32,000 Métis and First Nations people work in Canada's natural resources sector, which is the biggest employer of Indigenous people in Canada. In Lakeland and around Alberta, First Nations are very active in oil and gas across the value chain and upstream exploration and production and in service supply and technology in the oil sands, heavy oil, natural gas and on pipelines. In Lakeland, a Cree community of about 1,200 people, the Frog Lake First Nation, wanted to reduce poverty in their community and started their own oil and gas exploration company. Today, Frog Lake Energy Resources Corp extracts over 3,000 barrels of oil per day, which has brought millions of dollars into their community, and they have over $30 million in cash flow. The chairman of their board, Joe Dion, said, quote, Together, we have to make reconciliation a priority, given the economic risks and gridlock that continues to impede the resources sector nationally and Alberta's energy sector in particular. I believe that reconciliation can be realized right here in Alberta's energy sector. He says it's time to take bold action. Alberta is not at the crossroads, it's in the ditch. The story of Frog Lake is the story of Albertans and people across Canada. It's about aspiration and ambition, entrepreneurialism, and taking ownership of opportunities. Sometimes I think my colleagues in the NDP would have us believe that communities like Frog Lake don't exist, that all Indigenous people and communities are opposed to oil and gas, but that's just not the reality. The Fort McKay and Mikisew Cree bands invested $545 million to buy nearly half the shares in one of Suncor's storage facilities. There are 35 First Nations working together right now for the past 5 years to build an Indigenous-owned pipeline from Alberta to northern British Columbia, an initiative that would have the support of every single Indigenous community in 2 provinces along the route if it can go ahead. The Fort McKay near the Athabasca oil sands has an unemployment rate of 0%. and financial holdings in excess of $2 billion. Their band members have average annual incomes of $120,000. Goodfish Lake Development Corporation in Lakeland employs 150 Albertans through dry cleaning and laundry services which contract with oil and gas, one of which is located in the Whitefish First Nation, and a sewing and garment company in Fort McMurray called Protective Clothing Supplies Limited, which produces petrochemical workwear for businesses in the oil sands. All these communities provide jobs for their members and employ people outside of their communities too. Chief Archie Wakwan of the Mikisew First Nation said, quote, "I used to challenge industry in my previous years. Now I look back at it and say, what have I done in the past? Maybe I shouldn't have done it. There's a balance between the environment and industry. They have checks and balances for both sides, and we'd like to be a part of it." There are significant Indigenous opportunities, investment, and involvement in oil and gas. That's why it's vital that Indigenous communities be welcome to participate, and why thorough consultation with Indigenous communities about new energy projects is so important. The left often implies that there is currently no or insufficient consultation in Canada, but that's not and has never been true. In fact, a 2014 Worley-Parsons study confirmed Canada maintains the highest level of environmental stringency and compliance, the highest level of regulatory transparency, life cycle analysis, and notably, quote, "thorough consultation and collaboration with Indigenous peoples in the world." The exhaustive benchmarking of major oil and gas jurisdictions explicitly noted, actually, too, the incorporation of traditional knowledge as one of Canada's world-leading strengths in Indigenous consultation on energy. The uninformed and persistent attack on Canada's regulatory track record has both undermined Canada's reputation globally and has emboldened anti-energy activists who are fighting to shut down Canadian energy and exports, which in turn hurts Indigenous communities. Canadian oil and gas developers have also long been world leaders in best practices of Indigenous consultation on their projects, constantly improving early engagement and relationship development. Sometimes it's actually been the government that has had to catch up. Kinder Morgan, which is prepared to invest $7.4 billion in the Canadian economy, consulted with over 133 Aboriginal groups and communities, along with 2 non-boundary specific Aboriginal groups and 9 associations, councils, and tribes. All 43 First Nations along the route, 33 of which are in BC, signed mutual benefit agreements valued at over $400 million. And about 85% of the owners or occupants on the pipeline route actually raised no issues or concerns during the consultation. Chief Ernie Cray of the Shiam First Nations talked about the impact Trans Mountain has on his community. Quote, "If Trans Mountain doesn't proceed, in my opinion, hundreds of millions of dollars will be foregone to First Nations all the way along the pipeline route. Why I say this is that, taking my own community as an example, we negotiated really hard, and it was really my young council, they're a little over half my age, they really negotiated this agreement. Chief Gray said, quote, "My young council negotiated for a year and a half or more, night and day in some instances, with a pretty tough team on the other side, Kinder Morgan's team, yet we reached a mutual benefit agreement. I want to stress mutual benefits, benefits to the proponent and benefits to our community. The jobs that result from the expansion," he says, "are not one-shot jobs that are there for a year or two and gone when the pipeline is concluded. That's a terrible misrepresentation of things. What we've negotiated will be lasting training, lasting jobs, and over the entire life of what I hope will be the new pipe that will come from Alberta to Tidewater in British Columbia." Chief Cray says, quote, "Already our community is alive with excitement. Our young people every day come to me and say, I want to get trained, I want a job, I want to say goodbye to welfare. To us, it means millions of dollars to my band alone, a community of 540 people. I know it means a lot to many other First Nations who haven't stepped up and spoken out, but who have also perhaps agreements comparable to ours." Arthur Baird, the chief of the Paul First Nation, said, quote, "We have to support the development of the country and its economics because the economics of the country affects all of us in one way or another." In 2016, when Trans Mountain the expansion was waiting for approval, Mike Leberday, the former chief of the Whispering Pines Clinton Indian Band, said, quote, "I want the money from our resources so that we can pay for our health, so that we can pay for our education, so that we can pay for our elders, so that we can pay to protect our environment, so we can build better pipes, so we can build better bridges, so we can build better railways." The Peters First Nation says, quote, "We are concerned that among all of the well-funded and highly publicized opposition to the project, the voice of Indigenous nations that support TMX has been lost. Peters First Nation has lived with the original pipeline that was built over 50 years ago, seated at the base of our mountain and above our homes with no worries or incidents. The TMX pipeline is the safest way to transport needed natural resources out of our country for the benefit of all Canadians." Kinder Morgan provided more than $13 million to Indigenous communities to conduct traditional land or marine use studies and to participate in traditional ecological knowledge studies and other types of community-designed research. Kinder Morgan did due diligence and consulted with Indigenous communities impacted by the expansion and established economic partnerships. So it's frustrating to see activists outright oppose economic opportunity and security for dozens of Indigenous communities who desperately want it. And to put all this in context, the fact is 7 First Nations, which are not directly crossed by the expansion, are challenging it in court, which they have a right to do. And while they had a right to do it, a recent motion opposing the pipeline at AFN made big news, but the reality is it was backed by distant communities in other provinces not directly impacted by the pipeline. But should the hopes and work of 43 Indigenous communities be completely destroyed as a result? I don't think so. And while I and my Conservative colleagues believe pipelines and other energy projects should be paid for, built, maintained, and operated by the private sector, Alberta Indigenous groups are saying they want a stake in the Trans Mountain Pipeline now that government is negotiating its ownership. Pipelines and major energy projects should be and are rigorously examined and debated. Environmental stewardship is and must be continually improved in energy development. I believe all Canadians want to protect the environment for future generations. I'm glad Indigenous people who are partners in energy development are speaking out that they have been keepers of land and water for millennia and that they ensure exceptional environmental management as they pursue economic opportunities. It's mind-boggling that anti-energy activists don't see their own patronizing, demeaning implications when they ignore or trample on the rights of those Indigenous communities to self-determination on energy development. Both the Prime Minister and the left-wing coalition have, of course, been totally complicit in the Indigenous anti-energy myth for their own ideological and political reasons. The Conservative-approved Northern Gateway Pipeline was supported by more than 30 Indigenous groups with $2 billion in mutual benefit agreements, including training and employment opportunities. This Prime Minister had a choice. He could have instructed additional scope and time of consultation, as he did before Trans Mountain was approved, like the Supreme Court said the government could. But instead, he outright vetoed it completely. Chief Elmer Derrick of the Gitxsan Nation said the Prime Minister had no interest in hearing from First Nations who supported Northern Gateway. He said, quote, "The fact that the Prime Minister chose not to consult with people in northwestern BC disappointed us very much." Dale Swampy of the Samson Cree Nation said First Nations, quote, "weren't asked about the financial effect, the lost employment. They're trying to get themselves out of poverty, the welfare system that they're stuck to, and every time they try to do something like that, it's destroyed." First Nations and Métis communities spent 2 years and millions in legal fees developing agreements with Enbridge. But all of that work, all of that hope is now gone because of a purely political decision by this Prime Minister. And then there's his tanker ban, which was rammed through after little consultation with the Indigenous communities most affected by it. There's a $16 billion Indigenous-owned pipeline backed by 35 First Nations that would transport oil from Bruderheim in Lakeland to northern British Columbia. But the tanker ban is the obstacle. The Prime Minister never stopped to listen to the bands who oppose it. Eva Clayton, president of the Nisga'a in northwestern BC, said, quote, "Our government is committed to creating an economic base that meets the requirements of our treaty. We owe it to our people and their futures to preserve the opportunity to have different economic development options available to us. We will not continue to see our way of life eroded and consign our children and grandchildren to life without meaningful opportunities based on an ill-conceived policy decision." The Lac Kw'alaams First Nation, where the pipeline would end, strongly opposes the ban and the lack of consultation around it and has already launched a constitutional challenge against it. Calvin Helene, the chairman of Eagle Spirit and member of Lac Kw'alaams, said, quote, "We developed a model, particularly for the ocean, that has a higher environmental standard than the federal government is proposing anywhere else in Canada." The Prime Minister wants to talk about the importance of consultation with Indigenous people. I agree in principle and in practice, but it's cynical and hypocritical of him to ignore the Indigenous voices that disagree with his radical anti-energy agenda on a case-by-case basis. And it infuriates me to hear politicians speak of Indigenous people as their, quote, "most important relationship," and worry publicly about the real crippling poverty and particular socioeconomic challenges and barriers facing Indigenous Canadians, while deliberately using every possible means to block financial opportunities, to undermine all their efforts and work to secure agreements to benefit their communities, their elders, their youth, and their futures. The text of the NDP motion states in Part B that, quote, "Institutions like the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, which has said with respect to the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline that no means no. The project does not have the consent it requires, which is a principled position conducive to achieving the ends of the UNDRIP." But in a recent interview on CBC, Chief Robert Chamberlain, Vice President of that union, said, quote, "When we have First Nations that are definitely in support of this, that needs to be respected without question." He then went on to say, quote, "We have the divide and conquer of colonialism alive and well in Canada." Many other Indigenous community representatives have said the words the NDP quote in their motion don't speak for them. So, while the left tries to push the narrative that Indigenous people oppose resource development, it's simply not true. And it's destructive to Indigenous people and to all of Canada. And it's our job as legislators to make decisions in the broad best interests of all and to carefully weigh the costs and benefits to serve the public good. Obviously, the opinions, ideals, and needs of every Indigenous community are vast and diverse. There are pro-development Indigenous groups all across Canada, and there are others who are opposed for their own reasons. All have the right to express their views and to demonstrate peacefully. And I want to thank my colleague, the member for Abitibi Bay, James Nunavik EU, for his tireless efforts to advance truth and reconciliation in Canada and this discussion around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I share his commitment to advance truth and reconciliation in Canada. But I think it's critical we examine the motion and its potential implications, as should be the case for all motions here. I support UNDRIP's aspiration, and there are many elements that I and Conservative colleagues support. But as my colleague from Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, pointed out last week, even the current Liberal Justice Minister said, quote, "Simplistic approaches such as adopting the United Nations Declaration as being Canadian law are unworkable and, respectfully, a political distraction to undertaking the hard work actually required to implement it back home in communities." Now, I don't actually believe UNDRIP is simplistic. I think it's comprehensive and complicated, but my issue is it's designed as a global rather than a Canadian approach to protecting and advancing Indigenous rights. Canada is one of the only nations in the world where Indigenous rights and treaty rights are entrenched in our Constitution. And the Crown does have a duty to consult Indigenous people under Section 35, which I assume every member of this House supports. But the parameters in UNDRIP of what constitutes free, prior, and informed consent are not clearly defined. As the member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, has said, there are various interpretations, and the discrepancy in these interpretations is problematic in and of itself. Some First Nations think about having a comprehensive consultation process, whereas others have asked for something like veto power when it comes to new energy projects. Obviously, the hundreds of Indigenous communities who are owners, partners, and workers in Canada's responsible resource sector should not be at risk of all their opportunities being denied by one individual community, which may or may not be involved directly itself. All 43 nations along Trans Mountain signed agreements with Kinder Morgan and had, in other words, consented to the pipeline going through their lands. The NEB ensured exhaustive inclusion of Indigenous consultation in the regulatory process, and the Liberals did add more in 2016. Article 32.2 of UNDRIP states, quote, "States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, or other resources." I want to draw attention to the phrase, "any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources." Trans Mountain did receive approval from all nations it affected, so I'm not sure why the expansion is included in this motion explicitly, except because of politics, because of course the NDP opposes Trans Mountain and opposes pipelines. So on behalf of all the people in all the communities in Treaty 6 and Lakeland, I appreciate having had the opportunity to speak on behalf of the majority, the vast majority of my constituents who value energy development and support pipelines. Thank you.
Hear, hear.